The machete caught the light for less than a second, just a brief wink of reflected sun through the canopy gap, and Corporal Davies stopped breathing. By the time anyone else in the patrol registered what had happened, 3 men were already dead. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. It helps the project grow. The bodies lay where they fell, still clutching weapons they never fired. No one had heard the shots. That was the thing about Japanese snipers in the New Guinea highlands. They understood patience the way most men understood hunger. They could wait for hours, sometimes days, for that single glint of metal, that one careless movement, that fraction of a second when a man forgot the jungle had eyes everywhere. The patrol had been moving through what the maps called the Ramu Valley, though the maps were mostly guesswork, decorated with official-looking contour lines. The real terrain bore little resemblance to the neat brown shapes drawn in Melbourne offices. Here the jungle grew in layers, canopy trees towering overhead, dense undergrowth below, and in between, a twilight world where distances became meaningless and sounds arrived from impossible directions. Private Walsh had been the one carrying the machete. He'd been using it to clear creeper vines from the patrol's path, standard procedure for lead scout. The blade was Army issue, purchased in bulk from a contractor in Sydney who'd never seen a jungle and never would. It had been sharpened according to regulation, a clean, consistent angle that produced a sharp edge suitable for cutting rope, chopping wood, or any of the dozen tasks a soldier might need in conventional warfare. What it wasn't suitable for was staying invisible under a canopy that leaked light in unpredictable patterns throughout the day. Walsh's body was still warm when they found him. The bullet had entered just below his left ear and exited through his right temple, a trajectory that spoke of elevation and expert marksmanship. The 2 men behind him had died almost simultaneously, caught in follow-up shots before anyone could process what was happening. One of them was still holding his rifle at port arms, frozen in mid-step like a statue. The rest of the patrol had scattered according to training, diving into whatever cover presented itself and freezing in place. Davies, who'd been 4th in line, had thrown himself behind a moss-covered log and now lay perfectly still, his own machete pressed flat against his body, blade turned inward so nothing faced outward that might catch light. He'd learned that trick after losing his first patrol 3 months earlier. Not from any manual or officer's briefing, but from watching the men who survived versus the men who didn't. The survivors moved differently. They thought about angles and surfaces. They treated every piece of metal like a loaded weapon pointed at their own heads. Davies had started wrapping his machete handle with strips of cloth torn from his undershirt, anything to reduce the chance of accidental reflection. Some men went further, coating their blades with mud or charcoal, though that dulled the edge and made the weapon less effective for actual cutting. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The jungle sounds had stopped completely when the shooting started. Birds, insects, everything that made noise had gone silent. Now, gradually, the normal acoustic texture began returning. A bird called somewhere to the left, a tentative sound that other birds slowly answered. Davies could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a steady rhythm that seemed impossibly loud. His throat was dry, but he didn't reach for his canteen. The Japanese sniper was still out there, still watching, still waiting for movement. That was another thing the survivors knew. The first man to relax was usually the next man to die. Davies had seen it happen twice now. Men who thought 5 minutes of silence meant safety, who shifted position or checked on a wounded mate, who made the fatal assumption that danger had passed. Lieutenant Hendricks was somewhere behind Davies, probably behind different cover. The patrol had been 9 men when they'd started out from the forward camp at dawn. Now they were 6, maybe less if someone else had been hit without Davies seeing it. There was no way to check without moving, and movement meant death. So they waited. The sun shifted position overhead, changing the pattern of light that filtered through the canopy. What had been shadow became illuminated. What had been bright became dark. Davies watched a beam of sunlight creep across the forest floor, moving with the slow inevitability of a sundial, and wondered if the sniper was watching the same light, waiting for it to touch someone who hadn't calculated the angles correctly. Walsh's machete lay next to his body, blade facing upward, catching intermittent light as the wind moved branches overhead. Davies stared at it and felt something like rage building in his chest. 3 men dead because of a piece of sharpened steel that should have been their tool, not their executioner. The Army issued equipment designed for European warfare, for open fields and conventional tactics, and expected men to adapt it to an environment where everything familiar became a liability. Boots rotted in days, uniforms bred fungus, metal corroded and shone and killed the men who carried it. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Wright first heard about the Ramu Valley incident 4 days after it happened, filtered through 3 different reports that couldn't agree on basic facts. One said 5 men lost, another said 3. A third mentioned only that the patrol had sustained casualties from sniper fire. What all 3 reports agreed on was that the survivors had remained pinned down for nearly 6 hours before managing to withdraw under cover of darkness. 6 hours of lying motionless in the New Guinea heat, surrounded by the smell of their dead, not knowing if the next breath would be their last. Wright read the reports in his tent at the forward headquarters near Leh, where the coastal humidity made paper feel perpetually damp, and ink sometimes ran before it dried. He was 41 years old, which made him ancient by jungle warfare standards, and he'd been in New Guinea since the first Australian units arrived to stop the Japanese advance over the Owen Stanley Range. Before the war, he'd been a civil engineer in Brisbane, designing bridges that needed to account for flood loads and cyclone winds. He approached problems methodically, breaking them into components, looking for patterns that others missed. The Army had made him a battalion commander because they needed experienced officers, not because he fit any traditional military mold. The thing that caught Wright's attention wasn't the casualty numbers. Those had become grimly routine, but a detail buried in Corporal Davies' written statement. Davies had mentioned that Private Walsh had been using his machete to clear vines when the shooting started. He'd specifically noted the blade catching light. Wright read that line 3 times, then pulled out a folder he'd been keeping for the past 2 months. Inside were incident reports from 7 different patrols, all of which had been ambushed in similar circumstances. He laid them out on his camp table, creating a timeline. Each report mentioned something reflective: a machete, a bayonet, sometimes just a belt buckle, or the metal rim of a canteen. Small details that investigating officers had noted and then dismissed as incidental. Wright didn't think they were incidental. He'd lost his best scout, a Territorian named Mackenzie, who'd grown up hunting crocodiles in the Northern Territory and could move through scrub like smoke. Mackenzie had survived Kokoda, had been one of the few men who actually seemed suited to jungle fighting, who understood instinctively what the rest of them had to learn through trial and error. He'd been killed in late July while scouting a trail junction. The patrol had found him with his throat cut, his machete missing. The Japanese had taken it, along with his boots and ammunition. What they'd left behind was his body and a single playing card, the ace of spades, placed on his chest. A calling card, a signature, a message that someone out there was keeping score. After Mackenzie's death, Wright had started paying attention to things he'd previously ignored. He noticed that veteran scouts modified their equipment in ways that violated regulations but increased survival rates. They wrapped metal in cloth, painted blades with lamp black, filed down anything that protruded or caught light. Some of them refused to carry standard-issue machetes at all, preferring knives or even sharpened bamboo for clearing vegetation. When Wright asked why, the answers were vague. It just felt safer, or they'd seen what happened to men who didn't bother, or someone they trusted had told them to do it. None of them could articulate exactly what the problem was, only that it existed. Wright began conducting informal experiments. He'd take a standard machete and position it at different angles under the canopy, watching how light behaved on the blade surface. What he discovered was that traditional sharpening methods, the kind any competent armorer would use, created a mirror-smooth edge that reflected light in predictable directions. Under certain conditions, that reflection was visible from remarkable distances. He'd tested it with another officer, positioning himself 200 yards away while his colleague moved a machete through typical clearing motions. Wright could spot the flashes easily, even through dense undergrowth. A trained sniper with good optics could do far better. The implications were disturbing. The Army was issuing equipment that was functionally similar to carrying a signal mirror, then sending men into an environment where being seen meant being killed. Wright wrote a preliminary report suggesting that machete sharpening protocols needed revision. The report went to brigade headquarters and disappeared into whatever administrative void consumed inconvenient paperwork. 2 weeks later, he received a terse memo stating that current equipment met all specifications and that field modifications were discouraged as they voided contracts and complicated supply chains. The memo was signed by someone Wright had never heard of, probably a quartermaster officer in Port Moresby, who'd never been further forward than a well-defended supply depot. That was when Wright realized official channels weren't going to solve this. If men were going to stop dying from reflective metal, it would have to happen outside the formal command structure, through the unofficial networks that actually govern survival in forward areas. He needed someone who understood metallurgy and sharpening, someone who could translate theory into practice that ordinary soldiers could replicate. He found that person 3 days later, washing mess tins behind the quartermaster's tent. Sergeant Thomas Milligan had been a toolmaker at a factory in Adelaide before the war, specializing in precision grinding for industrial machinery. He'd enlisted in 1941, expecting to be assigned to an engineering unit where his skills might prove useful. Instead, the Army had looked at his paperwork, noted his trade background, and made him responsible for maintaining saws and axes at a forward supply depot. It was the kind of bureaucratic logic that put musicians in charge of ammunition and accountants on patrol duty. Milligan had spent the past year sharpening tools for men he'd never meet, watching equipment come back damaged or not come back at all. Wright found him working on a broken machete that someone had apparently used to pry open ammunition crates. The blade was chipped in 3 places and bent near the tip. Milligan was heating the metal over a small forge made from an old oil drum, preparing to straighten it before attempting repairs. He looked up when Wright approached, registered the officer's rank, and straightened to attention with the automatic reflex of a man who'd been in the Army long enough to know that officers appearing unannounced rarely brought good news. Wright told him to relax and asked if they could talk somewhere private. They ended up in the tool shed, a plywood structure that smelled of metal shavings and cutting oil. Wright explained what he'd been observing about reflection and ambushes, about the pattern he'd identified in incident reports, about his suspicion that standard sharpening methods were getting men killed. Milligan listened without interrupting, his expression neutral in the way of enlisted men who'd learned that opinions could be dangerous. When Wright finished, Milligan was quiet for a long moment, then asked if the colonel had any machetes he could examine. They spent the next 2 hours looking at blades. Wright had collected 6 from various sources, some from supply, others recovered from casualties, one that belonged to a scout who'd survived 4 months of continuous patrol duty. Milligan studied each one carefully, running his thumb along the edge, holding them at different angles to the light, occasionally pulling out a jeweler's loop he kept in his toolkit. The differences weren't immediately obvious to Wright's untrained eye, but Milligan pointed them out with the confidence of someone who'd spent years thinking about how metal behaved under different conditions. The supply issue machetes were sharpened to a consistent 20-degree angle on each side, creating what Milligan called a hollow grind. It was efficient for cutting and easy to maintain, which was why it had been specified in procurement contracts. The problem was that a hollow grind created a concave surface that acted like a focusing mirror, concentrating reflected light into bright spots visible from considerable distances. The veteran scout's machete, by contrast, showed a much rougher edge when examined closely. It had been sharpened at an inconsistent angle, somewhere between 25 and 30 degrees, and the surface had a matte texture that scattered light rather than reflecting it cleanly. Milligan explained that what they were seeing was the difference between factory sharpening and field improvisation. The scout had probably been maintaining his blade with whatever stones he could find, not following any particular system, just keeping it sharp enough to function. The randomness had accidentally created an optical property that made the blade less visible. Wright asked if that effect could be replicated intentionally. Milligan thought it could, but it would require understanding exactly what angle and surface texture provided the optimal balance between cutting ability and light diffusion. They began testing the next morning, using a small clearing behind the supply depot where Milligan had set up his grinding equipment. Wright had arranged for them to have uninterrupted access, telling other officers that they were conducting equipment evaluation trials. It wasn't entirely a lie, though the specifics would have raised questions he didn't want to answer. They started with a single machete, grinding it to different angles and checking how it behaved under various lighting conditions. The work was tedious and required precision that was difficult to achieve with improvised tools, but Milligan had a craftsman's patience, and Wright had an engineer's systematic approach. By the third day, they'd identified something interesting. At around 27 degrees, with a slightly convex surface rather than hollow or flat, the blades stopped producing concentrated reflections. The effect wasn't absolute. Metal was metal, and it would always reflect some light. But the reflections were diffuse and inconsistent, breaking up into multiple small glints rather than a single bright flash. More importantly, when the blade was in motion, the way it would be when clearing vegetation, it didn't create the steady winking pattern that Wright had observed with standard sharpening. Instead, it produced brief, scattered sparkles that were difficult to distinguish from natural movement in the environment. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Could the effect be maintained during regular use, or would the edge degrade back to a standard profile? Could ordinary soldiers replicate the sharpening technique without specialized equipment? Would the modified angle actually reduce casualties, or was Wright seeing patterns where none existed, imposing order on random violence? Milligan pointed out another complication. The optimal angle might vary depending on the specific steel alloy used in different machete batches. Military procurement wasn't known for consistency. What worked for one batch might not work for another. Wright decided they needed a field test, something controlled enough to provide meaningful data, but realistic enough to prove the concept. He selected a patrol scheduled to operate in an area known for sniper activity, terrain similar to where the Ramu Valley incident had occurred. The patrol leader was a lieutenant named Morrison, young enough to still believe that unconventional ideas might work, experienced enough to take precautions seriously. Wright explained what they were attempting without overselling it. Morrison agreed to have his scouts use modified machetes and report any differences they noticed. The patrol departed on a Tuesday morning and was expected back within 5 days. Wright waited, trying to maintain normal duties while watching the calendar. On the 4th day, Morrison's patrol returned early. All members present, no casualties. Morrison sought out Wright immediately, his expression unreadable. Morrison sat across from Wright in the operations tent, helmet on the table between them, his uniform still carrying the particular odor of men who'd spent days in wet jungle, sweat mixed with rot and the medicinal smell of insect repellent. He'd brought his lead scout with him, a wiry corporal named Chen, whose family had been market gardeners in Darwin before the war. Chen placed his machete on the table next to Morrison's helmet. The blade showed heavy use, nicked and stained, but the edge still held the angle that Milligan had ground into it 4 days earlier. Morrison's report was characteristically direct. They'd operated in the same grid square where 2 previous patrols had been hit in the past month. Dense canopy, limited visibility, exactly the kind of terrain where snipers had been most effective. They'd moved through areas where Japanese presence was confirmed but not engaged, had cleared trail sections that required machete work, had even spotted what might have been observation posts on elevated ground. Nothing had happened. No shots fired, no contact, no indication they'd been detected at all. Chen added that he'd felt exposed several times while using the machete, the same sensation he'd learned to trust as a warning, but each time the expected crack of a rifle shot never came. Wright asked if they'd maintained proper noise discipline, whether they'd followed standard procedures for movement and cover. Morrison confirmed they had, nothing different from previous patrols except the modified blades. 3 scouts had been carrying them, all sharpened to the same specification Milligan had developed. The other 6 men in the patrol had standard equipment as a control measure, though Morrison admitted that distinction had blurred somewhat when the scouts started sharing their machetes with others who needed to clear vegetation. By the 2nd day, most of the patrol had used the modified blades at some point. What made the test inconclusive was precisely what made it interesting. Wright couldn't prove the machetes had prevented contact because there was no way to know if contact would have occurred otherwise. The Japanese might have been absent from the area. The patrol might have simply been lucky. Sniper coverage was never absolute, and even in active zones, there were gaps in observation. Morrison acknowledged these variables, but added something that Wright found more compelling than statistical analysis. The men felt different carrying the modified blades. They moved with more confidence, worried less about exposure, trusted their equipment instead of fighting against it. Chen demonstrated how he'd been using the machete, showing Wright the specific motions required for clearing vines and cutting through undergrowth. With the standard sharpening, each swing produced a flash as the blade passed through patches of filtered sunlight. Chen had learned to minimize this by keeping the blade in shadow as much as possible, which meant awkward angles and reduced efficiency. With Milligan's modification, the flashing was dramatically reduced. Not eliminated, that would be impossible with polished steel, but broken up into scattered sparkles that didn't create consistent patterns. Chen said it felt like being able to breathe again, not having to calculate every movement around the possibility of reflection. Wright asked Milligan to sharpen 20 more machetes to the same specification. He wanted to run additional patrols, gather more data, establish whether the initial results would hold across different units and conditions. Milligan agreed, but pointed out a practical problem that Wright hadn't fully considered. The modified angle was difficult to maintain without proper equipment. Field sharpening with standard-issue stones would gradually wear the blade back toward conventional profiles. Soldiers would need training not just in combat skills, but in precision tool maintenance, something the Army had never prioritized. Most men barely understood how to keep their rifles clean, let alone how to maintain specific grinding angles on bladed weapons. The solution Milligan proposed was to create a simple jig, a guide that could be attached to a sharpening stone to maintain the correct angle through repeated use. He sketched the design on a piece of paper, showing Wright how a bent piece of metal could serve as a reference surface. The jig wouldn't need to be sophisticated, just consistent. Any soldier with basic coordination could use it to maintain their blade between proper sharpenings. Manufacturing them would be another matter. They'd need metal stock, basic machining capability, and time that neither Wright nor Milligan officially had for unauthorized projects. Over the next 2 weeks, Wright managed to equip 3 more patrols with modified machetes. The results were maddeningly ambiguous. One patrol reported no contact in an area where contact was expected. Another was ambushed but survived with minimal casualties, though whether the machetes played any role was impossible to determine. The third encountered a Japanese patrol in close quarters and engaged in a brief firefight that had nothing to do with reflection or visibility. Wright documented everything, building a file of observations and incident reports that suggested something was happening, but proved nothing conclusively. Then, on the 16th of September, a patrol operating near Kayapit returned with a captured Japanese soldier who'd been isolated from his unit and was willing to talk in exchange for water and medical treatment. The man was young, maybe 20, suffering from malaria and badly dehydrated. During the initial questioning, conducted through an interpreter attached to intelligence section, he mentioned that his unit had been warned about Australian patrols that moved differently than before, that were harder to spot and ambush. When pressed for details, he said something about shadows that no longer flashed, about hunters who'd learned not to carry mirrors. The interpreter thought the man was delirious from fever, speaking in metaphors that didn't translate clearly. But Wright, when he read the transcript later, recognized something else. Recognition. Awareness. The Japanese had noticed the change in Australian tactics, even if they didn't understand the specific mechanism. That meant Wright's theory wasn't just engineering speculation. It was producing observable effects that the enemy was tracking and attempting to counter. The question was whether those effects actually reduced casualties or merely changed the circumstances under which men died. Word spread through channels that had nothing to do with official communications. A corporal mentioned it to a sergeant during a supply run. A wounded scout recovering in the field hospital told other patients about the modified blades. Men wrote letters home describing new techniques without naming them specifically, and those letters were read by sensors who sometimes served in combat units themselves and passed information laterally through the command structure. By early October, Wright was receiving informal queries from officers he'd never met. asking if the rumors about special machete sharpening were true, and whether the technique could be shared with their units. Wright found himself in an unexpected position. He'd identified what he believed was a genuine tactical advantage, had developed a practical method for implementing it, and now faced the question of how to distribute that knowledge without triggering the bureaucratic resistance that had shut down his initial report. Going through official channels meant committees and evaluations and procurement reviews that could take months, while men continued dying from reflective equipment. Bypassing official channels meant operating outside his authority, potentially undermining the command structure, and accepting personal responsibility if the technique failed or caused unforeseen problems. Milligan argued for informal distribution. Train a few armorers from each battalion, show them the technique, let them pass it along to their units. Treat it like the dozens of other field modifications that soldiers made to survive. Unofficial, undocumented, deniable if questioned by senior command. Wright understood the logic, but worried about quality control. If the technique was taught incorrectly, if men started sharpening blades at random angles, thinking any variation was better than standard issue, they might create equipment that was both less effective for cutting and equally visible to enemy snipers. Worse, they might develop false confidence in modified blades that didn't actually provide protection. The compromise they reached was to create a training demonstration that Wright could conduct personally at forward positions. He'd show the technique to armorers and senior scouts, explain the principle behind it, and provide Milligan's jigs to units that wanted them. The demonstrations would be framed as equipment familiarization rather than formal training, avoiding the need for paperwork while still maintaining some standard of instruction. It wasn't elegant, but elegance wasn't a priority when measured against effectiveness. Wright conducted the first demonstration at a forward camp near Dumpu in mid-October. 15 men attended, mostly sergeants and corporals with patrol experience. He explained the reflection problem, showed them comparison tests with standard and modified blades, and walked them through the sharpening process step by step. The response was mixed. Some men immediately grasped the concept and started asking detailed questions about maintenance and field sharpening. Others were skeptical, pointing out that they'd survived months of jungle fighting with standard equipment and questioning whether blade angle really mattered compared to basic fieldcraft and tactical awareness. One veteran scout, a man named Williams who'd been fighting since the Kokoda campaign, challenged Wright directly. He said that men died in the jungle for 100 reasons, most of them having nothing to do with equipment. Disease killed more soldiers than snipers. Accidents and friendly fire accounted for significant casualties. Even in ambushes, the determining factors were usually terrain, timing, and enemy strength, rather than whether someone's machete caught the light. Williams didn't dispute Wright's observations about reflection, but he questioned whether solving that particular problem would meaningfully change survival rates, or just give men a false sense of security that made them careless in other ways. Wright had no good answer to that argument, because Williams was right about the complexity of jungle warfare. Reflection was one variable among many, and isolating its specific contribution to casualty rates was probably impossible without controlled conditions that couldn't exist in actual combat. What Wright could offer wasn't proof, but possibility. The chance that reducing one source of detection might shift odds slightly in favor of survival. That eliminating unnecessary visibility might create marginal advantages that accumulated over time. Williams remained unconvinced, but agreed to try the modified blades with his next patrol, saying he'd judge them by results rather than theory. The demonstrations continued over the following weeks, reaching perhaps 80 men across various units. Wright developed a routine presentation that took about 90 minutes and covered both the technical aspects of sharpening and the tactical reasoning behind the modification. Milligan manufactured additional jigs as quickly as improvised workshop conditions allowed, creating about 30 functional guides that were distributed to units showing the most interest. The whole operation existed in a gray area between authorized training and unauthorized tinkering, and Wright was careful never to formalize it in ways that might attract attention from officers who valued regulation compliance over practical results. By November, Wright started receiving feedback from units using the modified blades. The reports were anecdotal and impossible to verify, but they suggested that something was changing, Patrols operating in high-risk areas reported fewer ambushes. When ambushes did occur, they seemed to happen at different ranges or under different circumstances than before. Several scouts mentioned that they felt less exposed during trail clearing work, though they couldn't quantify that feeling beyond describing reduced psychological stress. One unit reported that a Japanese prisoner had specifically asked about Australian blade modifications during interrogation, suggesting the enemy was aware of the change and attempting to understand it. What troubled Wright was the lack of control data. He had no way to compare casualty rates between units using modified blades and units using standard equipment, because too many other variables were involved: terrain, enemy activity, unit experience, leadership quality, recent reinforcements, disease rates, supply conditions. Any statistical analysis would be compromised by factors he couldn't measure or control. He was operating on intuition and fragmentary evidence, the same basis that commanders had used throughout military history to make decisions that killed thousands of men or saved them. Then in late November, Wright received orders to report to brigade headquarters in Port Moresby. The message was terse and gave no indication of the meeting's purpose, but the tone suggested it wasn't a commendation. Port Moresby felt like a different war. The headquarters compound had paved roads, proper buildings with corrugated iron roofs, and men whose uniforms weren't rotting from constant moisture. Wright arrived on a transport flight that also carried mail, medical supplies, and 3 officers being rotated out for psychiatric evaluation. He'd brought his documentation, the incident reports, test results, and patrol feedback he'd been compiling, though he suspected it wouldn't matter. Unauthorized training programs were the kind of initiative that armies either ignored or punished, rarely anything in between. Brigadier Caldwell kept him waiting for 40 minutes in an anteroom where clerks typed requisition forms and filed papers with the methodical efficiency of men whose war consisted entirely of administrative processes. When Wright was finally called in, he found Caldwell behind a desk covered with maps and status reports, looking like someone who'd slept badly and expected the day to get worse. 2 other officers were present, a major from supply operations and a captain Wright didn't recognize, but whose collar insignia indicated Intelligence Corps. Caldwell opened with a question that wasn't really a question. He asked if Wright had been conducting unauthorized equipment modification training at forward positions without approval from Supply Command or clearance from Training Directorate. Wright confirmed that he had, then began explaining the reasoning behind it. Caldwell cut him off, saying he wasn't interested in reasoning, only in whether Wright understood that he'd violated proper channels and undermined established procurement protocols. The major from Supply added that field modifications voided equipment warranties and created liability issues if soldiers were injured using non-standard gear. Wright had expected this response, but it still struck him as absurd. Men were dying in the jungle while headquarters worried about warranty compliance and administrative procedure. He said as much, perhaps more bluntly than was wise when addressing superior officers. Caldwell's expression hardened. He pointed out that Wright's engineering background didn't qualify him to make decisions about equipment standards, that the Army had procurement specialists whose entire job was evaluating gear for combat effectiveness, and that allowing individual officers to bypass that system would create chaos where order was desperately needed. The intelligence captain intervened before the conversation could deteriorate further. He said that intelligence section had been tracking Wright's activities with interest, that they'd interviewed the Japanese prisoner who'd mentioned Australian blade modifications, and that they'd conducted their own analysis of patrol incident reports. What they'd found was inconclusive but intriguing. A statistically insignificant reduction in casualties among units known to be using modified equipment, complicated by too many confounding variables to draw firm conclusions. The captain said the data suggested Wright might be onto something, or might be seeing patterns in random noise, and that determining which required more rigorous testing than had been conducted so far. Caldwell asked what intelligence section recommended. The captain said they should either formalize Wright's program with proper oversight and documentation, or shut it down completely to prevent inconsistent implementation. Half measures would be worse than either extreme, spreading techniques that might not work, creating expectations that couldn't be met, fragmenting already limited resources across competing modification schemes. If the technique had genuine merit, it deserved systematic evaluation. If it didn't, continuing to promote it was irresponsible. The major from supply objected that formalizing the program would require renegotiating contracts with equipment manufacturers, rewriting technical specifications, and potentially recalling thousands of machetes from field units for modification. The cost in time and resources would be substantial. And for what? A hypothesis about light reflection that might explain a small subset of casualties in specific terrain under particular conditions? He argued that the Army's job was to fight the Japanese, not to redesign every piece of equipment based on individual officers' theories. Wright listened to them debate his work as if he weren't present, as if the question was purely administrative rather than about men bleeding out in the jungle after being spotted by snipers. He thought about Mackenzie, about Walsh from the Ramu Valley Patrol, about the dozens of other names in incident reports who died because their equipment made them visible. He thought about William's skepticism, which was probably more honest than Caldwell's bureaucratic concern. The truth was that Wright didn't know if the modified blades saved lives. He believed they did, had evidence that suggested they might, but couldn't prove it to any standard that would satisfy men who made decisions based on paperwork rather than observation. Caldwell made his decision with the finality of someone who'd already decided before the meeting started. Wright was to cease all unauthorized training activities immediately. Units that had already received modified blades could continue using them, but no further distribution would occur without proper authorization. Wright would submit a formal proposal detailing the modification procedure, expected benefits, implementation costs, and testing protocols. That proposal would be reviewed by a committee, including representatives from supply, training, and intelligence sections. If the committee determined the program had merit, it might be approved for limited trials under controlled conditions. The process would take a minimum of 6 weeks, probably longer. 6 weeks meant men would continue carrying equipment that Wright believed was killing them. 6 weeks meant the informal network he'd built would dissolve as units rotated, as scouts who'd learned the technique were killed or transferred, as the knowledge he'd spread faded without systematic reinforcement. Wright started to protest, but Caldwell cut him off again, saying the discussion was finished. Wright was dismissed with instructions to submit his proposal within 10 days and to refrain from any further independent action regarding equipment modification. Wright flew back to the forward area that evening, sitting in the cargo bay of a transport plane next to crates of ammunition and medical supplies. He'd brought his documentation to Port Moresby, thinking it might convince skeptics. Instead, it had convinced them only that he was a problem, requiring administrative management. Milligan met him at the airstrip, took one look at Wright's expression, and didn't ask how the meeting had gone. They walked back to camp in silence, while rain started falling, the kind of rain that would turn everything to mud within hours. Wright wrote his proposal over 3 days, working at night when administrative duties were finished, and the camp had settled into the uneasy quiet that passed for rest in forward areas. He documented everything with the precision his engineering background demanded. Measurement protocols, sharpening angles, light diffusion data, comparative analysis of reflection patterns. He included testimony from scouts who'd used the modified blades, incident reports showing reduced contact in specific operational areas, and even the translated statement from the Japanese prisoner mentioning Australian tactics changes. The final document was 16 pages of technical specifications and tactical assessment, thorough enough to satisfy any reasonable evaluation committee. He submitted it, knowing it would disappear into the same bureaucratic void that had consumed his initial report. Caldwell would forward it to the review committee, where it would sit on someone's desk while more urgent matters took priority. Eventually, someone would schedule a meeting to discuss whether to schedule another meeting to evaluate preliminary testing protocols. By the time any decision was made, the war might be over, or the strategic situation might have changed enough to make jungle fighting irrelevant. Wright had seen how military bureaucracy processed innovation, slowly, cautiously, and usually too late to matter. What he hadn't anticipated was that the informal network he'd built would continue operating without him. Milligan had trained other armorers in the sharpening technique before the Port Moresby meeting. Those armorers had shown it to scouts they trusted. The scouts had demonstrated it to other patrols. The knowledge was spreading through the kind of lateral communication that existed below the level of official orders. The way soldiers had always shared survival techniques that worked regardless of whether they appeared in field manuals. Wright had started something he could no longer control or stop, which should have worried him more than it did. By December, the modified blade technique had acquired characteristics that Wright found both encouraging and disturbing. Encouraging because men were clearly finding value in it. Units that had never contacted Wright directly were requesting sharpening jigs and asking questions about maintenance protocols. Disturbing because the technique was mutating as it spread, acquiring variations and embellishments that had nothing to do with Wright's original observations. Some units were sharpening their blades to angles steeper than Wright had specified. Others were coating them with mixtures of charcoal and animal fat to reduce reflection further. A few had started incorporating ritual elements, treating the sharpening process as something between maintenance procedure and protective ceremony. Wright heard about a patrol that had spent an entire evening sharpening their machetes by moonlight because someone had decided that artificial light created the wrong edge geometry. Another unit refused to let anyone sharpen blades except their senior scout, who'd apparently developed a reputation for producing modifications that guaranteed safety. The scout charged other soldiers cigarettes or chocolate for his services, creating a small economy around what Wright had intended as a simple technical procedure. When Wright tried to correct the misinformation, he found that soldiers preferred the mythologized version to his prosaic explanation of optical physics and reflection angles. Milligan found the whole situation darkly amusing. He pointed out that Wright had accidentally created exactly what the Army officially wanted, a standardized procedure that units would adopt voluntarily. The fact that they were adopting a corrupted version, full of superstition and improvisation, was irrelevant as long as the core technique remained effective. Milligan argued that the variations probably didn't matter much. Whether a blade was sharpened at 27 degrees or 30 degrees, whether it was done at night or during the day, whether the process included prayers or profanity, the critical factor was that men were thinking about reflection and taking steps to reduce it. The specific implementation details were less important than the awareness they created. Wright wasn't convinced. He'd seen what happened when soldiers relied on techniques they didn't understand, when they confused correlation with causation, and invested magical thinking in practical procedures. Men who believed their specially sharpened machetes made them invisible might take risks they wouldn't otherwise accept, might move carelessly through terrain that still demanded caution regardless of equipment modifications. The blade angle couldn't stop bullets, couldn't detect ambushes, couldn't compensate for poor fieldcraft or tactical mistakes. Treating it as a protective talisman rather than a marginal advantage was dangerous. Then, in mid-December, Williams returned from a patrol that had operated for 8 days in territory where Japanese presence was confirmed and active. He sought out Wright specifically to report that every man in his patrol had returned alive, that they'd cleared trails and conducted reconnaissance without a single contact, despite moving through areas where previous patrols had been ambushed regularly. Williams still wasn't convinced the machetes were responsible. He attributed their success primarily to good planning and disciplined movement. But he admitted that the modified blades had allowed them to work more efficiently without constantly worrying about reflection. The psychological benefit alone, he said, might be worth whatever administrative headaches Wright had created. Wright asked if Williams had maintained the sharpening angle correctly. Williams laughed and said his men had sharpened their blades however they wanted, some following Wright's specifications, others using their own methods, a few coating their machetes with mud because they'd heard that worked better. The result had been a collection of blades that looked nothing alike, but apparently all functioned well enough to get the job done. Williams said that maybe the specific angle didn't matter as much as Wright thought, that soldiers had a talent for finding what worked through trial and error, and that trying to impose engineering precision on combat conditions was probably missing the point. That conversation stayed with Wright for days afterward, undermining his confidence in the technical foundation he'd built. If the exact specifications didn't matter, if random variation produced equivalent results, then what had he actually discovered? Was the benefit coming from the blade modification itself, or from the increased attention soldiers were paying to reflection and visibility? Was he measuring equipment effectiveness or psychological placebo effect? The questions bothered him more than Caldwell's administrative resistance had, because they suggested that he might not understand his own discovery well enough to defend it against reasonable skepticism. The review committee finally convened in early January. Wright wasn't invited to attend, but received a summary of their conclusions 2 weeks later. The committee acknowledged that blade reflection might contribute to patrol casualties under certain conditions, but found insufficient evidence to justify large-scale equipment modification or changes to procurement protocols. They recommended continued observation of units using modified blades, but declined to authorize formal adoption of the technique. The decision was phrased as pending further study, which Wright recognized as bureaucratic language for permanent postponement. The strategic situation was changing in ways that made Wright's blade modification program increasingly irrelevant to the larger war. Allied forces were advancing, pushing Japanese units back toward the northern coast. The dense jungle fighting that had characterized the New Guinea campaign was giving way to more conventional operations involving artillery, air support, and coordinated infantry maneuvers. Units that had spent months conducting small patrol actions were being reorganized for offensive operations where machete reflection mattered far less than logistics and firepower. The conditions that had made Wright's observations relevant were disappearing, even as the technique he'd developed continued spreading through informal channels. Wright found himself assigned to planning operations for the Madang advance, work that kept him in headquarters tents studying maps rather than visiting forward positions where scouts were still sharpening blades according to specifications he'd taught them. The disconnection bothered him. He'd started this project because men were dying from something he believed could be prevented, and now he was coordinating artillery timetables while having no idea whether those same men were still dying or whether the modifications had made any difference. The war had moved on from his small attempt to solve one specific problem, and he'd been moved with it. Intelligence reports from early 1944 suggested the Japanese were aware of Australian blade modification practices and were attempting to counter them. Captured documents included sketches of what appeared to be training materials, showing different types of blade profiles, and instructions for identifying Australian scouts by equipment characteristics. One document specifically mentioned that some Australian units carried blades that didn't reflect light normally, describing them as blades that had been treated with special coatings or manufactured using different metals. The Japanese understanding was incorrect. They attributed the effect to material composition rather than sharpening technique, but their awareness indicated they'd noticed the change and were trying to adapt. Wright requested permission to examine these captured documents more closely. The intelligence officer who handled the request was the same captain who'd attended the Port Moresby meeting, and he seemed amused by Wright's continued interest in what he called the Machete mystery. He let Wright review the documents, but pointed out that Japanese tactical adaptations were occurring across multiple domains simultaneously. They were adjusting to Australian night movement patterns, changing their ambush protocols, repositioning observation posts, and modifying their own equipment. Isolating blade reflection as a significant factor in these changes was impossible when so many variables were shifting at once. What the documents did confirm was that Wright's theory about reflection and detection had been fundamentally correct. The Japanese had been using blade flashes as targeting cues, had trained snipers to watch for them, and had positioned observation posts specifically to monitor trail sections where vegetation clearing was necessary. Whether the countermeasures Wright had developed actually reduced casualties remained unproven, but the underlying problem he'd identified was real. That validation should have satisfied him, but instead left him frustrated. He'd been right about the problem, had developed a practical solution, and had watched the Army's institutional machinery ensure that solution would never be formally implemented or systematically evaluated. Milligan was more philosophical about the outcome. He pointed out that hundreds of soldiers were now carrying blades that probably worked better than standard issue, that the technique would continue spreading as long as men found it useful, and that formal army approval had never been necessary for effective field modifications. Soldiers had been improvising equipment improvements since armies were invented, usually without waiting for procurement officers to validate their innovations. The difference was that most modifications remained local and temporary, while Wright's technique had achieved enough distribution to become semi-permanent in unit culture. Milligan considered that a success, regardless of what committees decided. They were having this conversation in February when word came through that Morrison's patrol, the same unit that had conducted Wright's first field test, had been hit hard during a river crossing operation. 5 men killed, 3 wounded, Morrison among the dead. The action report indicated they'd been caught by machine gun fire from a concealed position, a straightforward tactical ambush that had nothing to do with reflection or blade angles. Wright read the report and felt the familiar weight of command responsibility. The knowledge that men he'd known were dead, and that their deaths were part of the larger mathematical equation that measured military effectiveness in casualty ratios and territorial gains. He attended Morrison's memorial service, along with 24 other officers and enlisted men. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice and duty, using words that had been worn smooth by repetition until they meant almost nothing. Wright stood in the rain, listening and thinking about how Morrison had believed in the blade modification enough to test it, had returned from that first patrol alive and convinced it worked, and had died 3 months later in circumstances where no equipment modification could have saved him. The randomness of survival in combat made nonsense of any attempt to identify single factors that determined outcomes. Men lived or died based on variables so numerous and interconnected that claiming to have improved their odds through blade sharpening felt almost offensive in its reductive simplicity. After the service, Chen approached Wright. The scout had survived the ambush that killed Morrison and was scheduled to return to operations after a brief rest period. He still carried the machete that Milligan had modified for the original test patrol, the blade now showing months of hard use, but still maintaining something close to the original sharpening angle. Chen said that he wanted Wright to know that Morrison had believed the technique worked, that Morrison had personally ensured his unit continued using modified blades even after Wright had been ordered to stop training others. Chen said it as if Wright needed absolution or reassurance, as if Morrison's belief somehow validated the entire enterprise despite its bureaucratic failure. Wright thanked Chen, but didn't know what else to say. The truth was that he'd lost confidence in his ability to determine whether the technique actually worked. Too many patrols using modified blades had been ambushed. Too many using standard equipment had returned safely. The sample sizes were too small, the variables too numerous, the survival outcomes too random to support confident conclusions about causation. He'd convinced himself he'd found something important, had persuaded others to adopt it, and now couldn't prove it mattered. That uncertainty was harder to bear than Caldwell's administrative rejection had been. By March of 1944, the fighting had shifted so far north that the terrain where Wright had first developed his blade modification theory was now rear area, used for supply routes and medical evacuation, rather than active patrol operations. New units arriving from Australia carried updated equipment and followed tactical doctrines that reflected lessons learned from 2 years of jungle warfare. Some of these units had heard about blade modification techniques through the informal networks Wright had inadvertently created. Others had never encountered the concept and found it strange when mentioned by veterans who'd served in the earlier campaigns. Wright was transferred to a staff position in Brisbane in April, removed from field operations entirely, and assigned to work on post-war planning for veteran reintegration programs. The transfer felt like exile disguised as promotion, a way of moving him away from the operational questions he'd become obsessed with. He spent his days in an office, reviewing demographic projections and economic forecasts, trying to estimate how many returning soldiers would need employment assistance or medical care. The work was important in its own way, but felt disconnected from anything he understood or cared about. He'd become a staff officer, the kind of person he'd resented when he was forward, making decisions about other people's lives from the safety of administrative positions. Milligan stayed in New Guinea, continuing to serve as an armorer at supply depots that moved progressively northward as Allied forces advanced. They corresponded occasionally through mail that took weeks to arrive and was heavily censored. Milligan's letters described the evolution of blade modification practices in units he serviced. The technique had fragmented into multiple variations, some maintaining Wright's original specifications, others incorporating changes based on local experimentation or misunderstood principles. One unit was reportedly sharpening blades at 45-degree angles because someone had decided steeper was always better. Another had abandoned angle considerations entirely in favor of coating blades with tree resin to prevent reflection, a method that worked until the resin melted in tropical heat. What interested Wright most in these letters was Milligan's observation that blade modification had become a cultural marker distinguishing experienced jungle fighters from newly arrived troops. Veterans sharpened their machetes in specific ways and treated the practice as a ritual that separated men who understood the environment from those who didn't. The technical rationale Wright had provided had been absorbed into unit tradition and transformed into something that was part superstition, part practical knowledge, and part group identity formation. Milligan thought this was probably healthier than trying to maintain engineering precision in field conditions, that allowing the technique to evolve organically meant it would survive in forms that actually worked for the men using it. Wright wasn't sure whether to be pleased or disturbed that his careful technical specifications had dissolved into folk practice. He'd wanted to save lives through systematic application of optical principles, not create cargo cult rituals around blade sharpening. But Milligan had a point about organic evolution. The techniques that survived would be the ones that proved useful to soldiers, regardless of whether they matched Wright's original design. If the surviving variations worked, even for reasons different from what Wright had intended, then perhaps the specific implementation details mattered less than the general awareness of reflection as a tactical consideration. In June, Wright received an unexpected letter from Williams, the scout who'd been skeptical of the blade modification from the beginning. Williams had been promoted to sergeant and was training new recruits in jungle warfare techniques at a camp in Queensland. He wrote that he'd been instructed to include blade maintenance in his training program, not because any official doctrine required it, but because enough veteran officers had mentioned it that training command had decided to incorporate it informally. Williams asked Wright for technical specifications he could use for instruction, saying he wanted to teach the technique correctly rather than perpetuate the garbled versions that were circulating. Wright sent Williams a detailed response with diagrams and sharpening protocols, along with a candid admission that he wasn't certain the technique actually reduced casualties in measurable ways. He explained the statistical problems, the confounding variables, the difficulty of isolating equipment effects from tactical and environmental factors. He said that Williams should teach it if he thought it useful, but shouldn't oversell its effectiveness or create expectations that couldn't be met. Wright tried to be honest about the limits of his knowledge, while still providing practical guidance for instruction. Williams never replied, and Wright didn't know if his letter had arrived or whether Williams had decided the equivocation wasn't worth incorporating into training. The war in New Guinea was effectively over by late 1944, Japanese forces reduced to isolated pockets that posed no strategic threat. Fighting continued elsewhere in the Pacific, but the jungle campaigns that had characterized Australia's involvement were transitioning to history rather than current operations. Wright found himself interviewed by a military historian who was documenting equipment modifications and field innovations for an official record. The historian was interested in the blade modification technique as an example of bottom-up innovation, soldier-driven adaptation to environmental challenges that formal procurement processes had failed to address. Wright described the development of the technique as accurately as he could, emphasizing the observational basis and the engineering principles involved. The historian asked if Wright believed the modification had saved lives. Wright said he didn't know, that the evidence was insufficient to support confident claims, and that the technique's actual effectiveness might be less important than what it represented. Soldiers taking active steps to improve their survival odds, rather than passively accepting whatever equipment they were issued. The historians seemed disappointed by this answer, clearly hoping for a more definitive success story. Wright didn't care about disappointing historians. He cared about whether men had died who might have lived if the technique had been implemented systematically, rather than spreading through informal networks. In September, Milligan wrote with news that blades sharpened according to Wright's specifications were showing up in units that had never been to New Guinea, that had never operated in jungle terrain at all. Soldiers were modifying their machetes based on rumours and second-hand accounts, applying techniques designed for tropical canopy conditions to European forests and Pacific islands, where the tactical considerations were entirely different. Milligan thought this was absurd, but also inevitable. Successful innovations always got applied beyond their original context, usually with diminishing returns. He suggested that Wright should write something formal, documenting the technique and its proper application before the distorted versions became too entrenched to correct. Wright considered the suggestion, but couldn't bring himself to write the document. What would he say that he hadn't already said in his rejected proposal to the review committee? How could he formalise knowledge that he increasingly suspected was more art than science, more psychological than physical, more about soldier confidence than optical physics? The official history of the New Guinea campaign, published in 1947, made no mention of blade modification techniques or reflection-based tactical adaptations. Wright read through its 800 pages looking for any reference to the work he'd done, and found nothing. The historians had focused on major operations, strategic decisions, casualty statistics aggregated at division level. The small innovations that individual officers had developed to solve specific problems weren't considered historically significant enough to document. Wright understood the reasoning. Comprehensive military histories couldn't catalogue every field modification or unauthorized training program. But the absence still felt like erasure of something that had mattered to the men who'd used it. Milligan returned to Adelaide in 1946 and reopened his tool shop, returning to precision grinding for industrial machinery as if the war had been an interruption rather than a transformation. He kept one of the sharpening jigs he'd manufactured in New Guinea, mounted it on his workshop wall as a curiosity that occasionally prompted questions from customers. Milligan would explain it was a guide for maintaining specific blade angles, and when pressed for why that mattered, he'd say it was related to optical properties and light reflection. Most people lost interest after that explanation. The few who asked follow-up questions usually turned out to be veterans who'd heard rumors about special blade sharpening techniques and wanted to know if they were true. Wright stayed in the Army through demobilization, processing discharge paperwork for thousands of men returning to civilian life. He retired with the rank of colonel in 1948 and took a position with a construction firm in Sydney, designing bridges again as he'd done before the war. The work was familiar and demanding, requiring the same attention to load calculations and stress analysis that he'd once applied to blade angles and reflection patterns. He was good at it, successful in conventional terms, but something had changed in how he approached problems. He'd learned in New Guinea that being technically correct wasn't sufficient if you couldn't convince institutions to implement your solutions, that individual insight mattered less than organizational adoption, and that the gap between knowing something and proving it could be unbridgeable. In 1952, Wright received a letter from Chen, the scout who'd carried a modified machete through multiple patrols and had survived the ambush that killed Morrison. Chen had immigrated to Melbourne and was working in market gardening, the trade his family had practiced before the war. He wrote that he still owned the machete from his service days, that he'd kept it sharpened to the same angle Wright had specified, even though he now used it only for clearing brush on his property. Chen said the blade had become something like a talisman for him, a physical reminder of patrols survived and friends lost, and that he wanted Wright to know it had mattered. Whether the specific sharpening angle had saved his life, or whether he'd just been lucky, Chen couldn't say. But the discipline of maintaining the blade had given him something to focus on during the war, a small element of control in circumstances where control was mostly illusion. Wright appreciated the letter more than Chen probably realized. It represented the kind of validation that official histories and committee reviews had never provided. Personal testimony from someone who'd actually used the technique under conditions where mistakes were measured in lives rather than administrative inconvenience. Wright wrote back thanking Chen and saying that he hoped the blade had helped, that he'd wanted it to help, but that he'd never been certain whether it actually had. He didn't hear from Chen again after that exchange, but he kept the letter in a desk drawer where he occasionally reread it when he needed reminding that his work in New Guinea had meant something to someone. The technique itself survived in forms Wright wouldn't have recognized. By the 1960s, various military forces around the world had incorporated blade maintenance protocols that emphasized non-reflective surfaces and controlled sharpening angles. Whether these derived from Wright's original work or represented independent discovery of the same principles was impossible to determine. Military knowledge evolved through channels that rarely preserved attribution, techniques spreading laterally between units and across national boundaries, without documentation of origin. Wright saw references to anti-reflection blade treatments in military journals and wondered if they connected to what he'd started, but the technical details were usually different enough that direct lineage was questionable. Wright died in 1973, having never written a comprehensive account of the blade modification program or attempted to claim credit for innovations that had become absorbed into general military practice. His obituary mentioned his engineering career and his service in New Guinea, but said nothing about machetes or reflection angles, or the months he'd spent trying to convince the army that small details could determine whether men lived or died. Milligan attended the funeral and spoke briefly with Wright's daughter, mentioning that her father had developed techniques during the war that had probably saved lives, though proving it had been impossible. The daughter seemed interested but didn't pursue the topic, and Milligan didn't elaborate. The machete that Chen had kept for decades eventually ended up donated to a military museum in Melbourne, displayed among other artifacts from the New Guinea campaign, without explanation of its particular significance. The blade's edge still showed traces of the angle Milligan had ground into it in 1943, though museum staff who catalogued it noted only that it appeared to be standard issue equipment with some field modification of unknown purpose. No placard explained the theory behind the sharpening angle, or mentioned Wright's name, or described the informal network that had spread the technique through Australian forces. It was just another blade among thousands, distinguished only by survival when so many others had been lost to rust, jungle rot, or the chaos of warfare that consumed equipment as readily as it consumed the men who carried it. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment.